Hi everyone, I'm Courtney. This video is to help you learn English. Listen to learn new vocabulary. Today, I'm going to talk about the difference between the West Coast and the East Coast in the United States. The West Coast and the East Coast are different. The West Coast has states like California and Oregon and Washington. The East Coast has states like the Carolinas, Florida, Maine. So, what's the main difference between the West Coast and the East Coast? Well, one difference is the way the people act. This is a generalization. On the West Coast, people are a little bit more laid back. They're a little bit less in a hurry. The weather on the West Coast is a little bit better. So I think that helps people relax a little bit more. If it's hot outside, people will be a little bit more chill, a little bit more relaxed. People on the East Coast are a little bit more serious, a little bit more determined, a little bit more in a hurry. They're not as relaxed. They're more concerned about being productive and about progress. There's also a popular way to describe the difference between people on the West Coast and the East Coast. This is the story. If you get a flat tire on the West Coast, people will drive by you and say, "I hope that you get your flat tire fixed. I hope everything works out." But they'll keep driving. They won't stop to help you. People on the East Coast will see you and they'll get out to help you. They'll get out of their cars to help you, but they will complain about how stupid you are the whole time for getting a flat tire. This is a broad generalization. It's a stereotype. Every stereotype has a little bit of truth to it. I've met people from the West Coast and the East Coast that don't fit this. But I think it's fairly accurate. Another difference between the West Coast and the East Coast is how many states are on each side. There are a lot less states on the West Coast than on the East Coast. When we say East Coast here, a lot of times people think of the New England states, the states in the upper northeast. Yeah, Florida is East Coast, and North Carolina and South Carolina are East Coast. But I feel like the states on the East Coast have a little bit of their own identity, and the West Coast kind of merges together more. Oregon, California, Washington, they all have separate identities, but at least to me, the West Coast feels more like one kind of identity, and the East Coast feels a lot more separated according to each state. There's also differences in the land on the West Coast and the East Coast, the different types of landscapes that you'll see. On the West Coast, there's going to be a lot of pine trees, especially in the northern parts. And then you'll get more of the beaches and the deserty types of areas in the southern parts. And on the East Coast, you'll get forests, but not as much pine. There are more deciduous trees. And then it's really only Florida and the North Carolinas where it starts to turn into the beach and nicer weather. One thing I always notice when I come back to the West Coast is that the air is so fresh. The air on the West Coast is a lot less humid. I'm sure it depends where you go, but the air on the West Coast to me feels fresh. It's a lot drier air. The air on the East Coast has a lot more humidity. It feels a little bit more oppressive. I love coming back to the West Coast. I'm originally from Montana, and Montana isn't on the coast, but it's in the western part of the U.S. Something about the air, something about the West Coast is something that I love. In general, the West Coast is a little bit more rural than the East Coast. There's still huge cities in the West Coast, but it's a lot busier and a lot more urban on the East Coast. Tell me about your country. Do you have a West Coast and an East Coast, or maybe a northern part and a southern part? What are the differences in your country depending on which part you're in? I'd love to hear it in the comments. I'm Courtney. Thanks for watching. And if you want to watch another video to help you improve your English, you can watch this one next. Bye!